Good morning, and thank you, Ron. And it really is great to see Ron. I don't want to say how long we've known each other, but it's been a long time. And we were in the trenches together as young kids trying to change the world. And I think in a lot of respects we're still trying to change the world. And I wish more people felt that way these days. I have a 20, so I'm going to get change from you and make a couple of. But first, thanks for the invitation. So that's solid.
I'll count.
By the way, I'm also, to add to the list, I'm also an FIU graduate. It's tough, man. Book was published by UPenn.
That's true.
I better stop. So. After all the years of working politically, I decided to run for office in 2000. I had been in the private sector my entire life as a lawyer, a restaurateur, a real estate developer, and a few other things. But I thought it was important for us as a city and as a community, really, because the brand is Miami, whether you live in Pinecrest or anywhere else in South Florida. We are identified from the outside as really as Miamians. So as the brand goes, so goes the rest of South Florida, in my opinion. And so after serving 2 terms and having had the honor and the opportunity to work nationally with my colleagues around the country, unfortunately spent an enormous amount of time in Washington, D.C., and even more unfortunate, spending a lot of time in Tallahassee. I decided to write the book, and I wrote the book because after all that background, I'm very disappointed with the way politics in America is today. And so I wanted to make the point, and if you read the book, and I hope you will, Amazon.com. Politics in America has to change. That's the first line of the book. And I think we've gotten to a point where, regardless of what side of the political aisle you're on, I think we generally can agree that we're not satisfied, do not feel satisfied with the state or the direction of our country. We seem to go from crisis to crisis without any kind of a forward-thinking long-term plan. In Washington, they don't manage crisis, they manage by crisis. And our elected officials today seem to be more concerned with governing for the next election as opposed to the next generation. And so the results that we see out of Washington are, in my opinion, embarrassing. We don't have a budget. I mean, the United States of America is operating without a budget. Instead, we have continuing resolutions, which simply means that they crank up that money printing machine that they have in Washington and kick the can down the road. We don't have an economic plan, which is why we keep having the issues that we do with the debt ceiling crisis and the fiscal cliff and all those other new terms that have been added to American popular vocabulary by this Congress. We don't have an energy plan. It's hard to believe that over 100 countries got together and signed the Kyoto Protocol, and that the United States of America refused to do so. And we don't have an infrastructure or capital plan. And so we get bridges to nowhere. We fund projects in America based on seniority and based on who's the chair of a particular committee in Congress, as opposed to the long-term impact and the importance of a particular project. And so the point that I make in the book is that despite that dysfunction that exists in Washington, cities are very different. And I offer 3 reasons why. First, it's the government closest to the people. Mayors and local officials cannot hide. I mean, you're going to run into elected officials, local elected officials, at their places of worship, at a restaurant, down the street having a cup of coffee, and you're going to let them know exactly what's on your mind. And so you don't have the benefit of and the comfort of escaping to the Beltway and avoiding real people contact. The other thing is that cities are the economic engine of America. 92% of the economic growth of this country is concentrated in metropolitan areas of the United States. And close to 90% of all jobs, income, the population, and gross domestic product is generated out of metropolitan areas. If you contrast what I said earlier about Washington, let's talk about budgets. Mayors have to approve budgets. We have to balance, cities have to balance, and counties have to balance their budgets. And there are budget hearings that people actually do show up to and tell you what they think. At the local level, you create economic development programs that actually do create jobs. I mean, mayors and local government have been creating jobs for years. Washington just discovered recently that creating jobs is an important thing. Capital and infrastructure plans. You know, when a bridge collapses, it's the mayor who has to be out there. We all remember the Minneapolis story. It was Mayor Ryback who has to go there and be the face of the problem and try to fix the problem. And by the way, at the same time, console the families that are going through the grief of that particular accident. On the energy front, when the United States refused to be a part of Kyoto, mayors came together in 2005 and said, if our government isn't going to do it, if our federal government isn't going to do it, we're going to do it. And so we drafted something called the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which has now been signed by 1,100 mayors around the United States. In essence, implementing Kyoto at the local level and bypassing the federal government. And the 1,100 mayors, as you can imagine, includes Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all regions of the country, all size cities, because from a mayor's perspective, the environment should not, and is not really, a partisan issue. Now, the second point is, if you look at where ideas and where innovation occurs, it occurs at the local level. Today, Washington, I don't know of any ideas that really are coming out of Washington. I mentioned in the book that some of us, some 50 years ago, were inspired by a young American president who said, we're going to the moon. And I'm sure at the time, a lot of people must have thought he was crazy. And I'm sure at the time he had absolutely no idea how, in fact, we were going to achieve that goal. But in that process, he inspired plenty of Americans to public service and to that goal. By the way, I was one of them. We don't have that today. We don't have a go to the moon moment in America. And to me, that is what leaders do. Leaders dream and lead others to that dream. Because in doing so, I think grand ideas inspire grand action from people. And I use examples in Miami to highlight that point. For example, when I got into office, Miami was, in my opinion, a very filthy city. And I am a stickler for cleanliness and you know, things have to be in order. And I said, well, Miami's gonna be the cleanest large city in America. And people looked at me kind of cross-eyed and said, you know, that's never gonna happen. Well, yes it did. It happened a few years later, where Forbes came out with their survey and declared Miami the cleanest large city in America. Education. When I ran for office, people would, my opponents, in fact, would mock me because the mayor has nothing to do with education. I know you had Superintendent Carvalho here recently. And I said, well, how is that possible? How is it possible that you're the mayor of a city, these kids live in your city, these kids represent the future of your city, and you're telling me because statutorily I have no jurisdiction over the educational system that I should simply just say it's not my job and let our schools continue to fail. That is an unacceptable result. At the time, we had Superintendent Crew in Miami, and he and I got together and established something called the Education Compact, which has now been adopted not only by a number of other municipalities locally, but by a number of cities across the country. And what it was a partnership, in essence, a joint venture between a municipality and a school system, where we set very measurable, definable goals and steps to achieve those goals that we would measure ourselves on a regular basis. And I would go and speak in front of the school board, and he would come and speak in front of the commission on a regular basis to talk about the progress and to monitor that progress. Well, when I took office, our schools, 60% of our schools were rated D or F by state standards, FCAT. By the time I left office, 60% of our schools were either A or B. Now, it wasn't the city that was running the schools, it was the school board, obviously, that was running the schools, but two things happened. Number one, they knew we were looking, and they knew someone was holding them accountable. And in addition to that, we did work on specific things. We started offering all kinds of after-school computer programs in our parks. On Saturdays, when they had the Parents Academy, we would bring the parents in and not only talk to them about their children's education, but also the kinds of benefits that the city could make available to them. And in putting together all of that, I think we did and had the kind of impact that we had with our schools. Affordable housing. When I took office, our entire affordable housing portfolio for the city of Miami was $300,000, 3 units. And I said, well, I mean, obviously this is unacceptable, and we're going to set a goal. The goal is going to be $1 billion by the end of the decade. Again, people looked at me kind of cross-eyed and said, you're crazy. By the time I left office, we hit $1.1 billion. You know, very much in the news today, certainly in the last few days, police shootings. When I took office, I actually called in the Department of Justice, because if you all remember at the time, Miami police was basically shooting anything that walked. And I said, this is dysfunctional, this can't be, I need to understand, and I'm obviously not going to bring in the fox to guard the hen house. I want somebody from the outside. DOJ came in, I brought in a new police chief, and we got a clean bill of health from the Department of Justice. In the process, for example, when our chief of police got sworn in, by the way, there were 13 police officers standing trial, a federal trial, for shootings, including planting guns after shootings to try to justify the shooting. From that moment that he got sworn in, we went 20 consecutive months without a police officer discharging a weapon. Not one, not even by accident shooting themselves in the foot in the locker room, not a single discharge of a weapon. And then we had a shooting, and then we went another, I think, 10 or 12 months without a shooting. And in the process, we established the confidence of the community in the police department. I wanted to move people back into the urban core. I know we're in the suburbs today. But to me, it was important for a lot of reasons, including environmental reasons, that we establish an urban core, that downtown Miami really become a downtown again, a vibrant downtown, not the one that shuts down at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, roll up the carpets and turn off the lights and everybody flies out to the suburbs, but one that actually had people living in it and had a thriving business community. In the 10-year period, in the last decade, we built, or developers built, 99 high-rise residential buildings, and we now have a population of 80,000 people living in the urban core. Those are just some of the ideas and the goals and the vision that we laid out for Miami, and obviously we achieved them. And I want to make the final point is the business perspective of all of this, because I think the debate today in America totally misses the point between investing and spending. The government has to invest. Government has to invest, but it should invest with the same sort of general standards that you would apply in the business community. You should have accountability measures. There should be a return on your investment. It's not about spending or not spending. Spending can be just simply spending for the sake of spending. Investing is very different, as you all know, from the private sector. And so for examples like getting back to education, it's estimated that 12 million students will drop out of our high schools by the end of in the next 10 years. The cost of the American economy of that occurring is $3 trillion. The normalization of the 11 million estimated illegal immigrants in the United States will lead to $1.5 trillion positive effect in our economy. I think that those are, in my opinion, smart investments. And I'll tie that into an investment that we made in Miami, which a lot of people like to demagogue, and that was the Performing Arts Center, the Arts Center. It's very difficult when you're in public office to talk about art and culture, because it's a perfect opportunity for a lot of demagogues to use it as you're supporting the wealthy, you're supporting the wine and cheese crowd, and we should be feeding starving children somewhere. I'll give you just absolute numbers. The Performing Arts Center is in a community redevelopment area. That's a tax increment district. The 5 years, we did the study while I was in office, the 5 years preceding the breaking ground on the Performing Arts Center, the tax increment for that area was $40 million over a 5-year period. The 5-year period after it opened, the tax increment was $1 billion. Now, I think that's a pretty good investment. From a business perspective, forget about the politics. I don't care if you like opera, I don't care if you like ballet, it doesn't matter to me. The point is that the shock to the local economy, to the economy of Miami, was an extremely, extremely positive one. And there are a number of other investments like that we made. I mean, we were talking earlier about the environment. I started talking about green buildings in Miami. Miami had no reputation whatsoever for being environmentally friendly. In fact, I would argue quite the opposite, and we still, I think, do some things with our wetlands and the Everglades that are horrendous, and you know, we were talking about sea level rise, and most of the local politicians are still in denial when it comes to those kinds of conversations. But when I went to the business community about green buildings, and by the way, we had 0. In 2005, we now have 200. And it's actually law now in Miami that if you're going to build, you have to have at least a minimum LEED Silver certified. So I went to our business community, and I didn't talk to them. I didn't show them pictures of icebergs, the North Pole, and polar bears. I went to them and I said, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to bring your counterparts from around the country to sit down with you. Developers, architects, engineers, interior designers, anyone involved in the development process. I'm going to bring those folks over and have them explain to you how in New York or Boston and other cities around the country, they've been able to build green buildings at basically the same cost, or just nominal. They're also going to show you, by the way, how you're going to save a lot of money on operating costs, how the resale value of the building is going to increase, how you're able to attract more tenants, and how you're able to retain more tenants and get more rent from tenants because it is a green building. And after going through that process for several months, the business community, on their own, before it was law, came to me and said, we're going to follow this, we're going to do this. Again, even though I am a firm believer in sea level rise and a firm believer, you know, in global warming, I wasn't going to be able to sell the goal that I wanted. I wasn't going to be able to sell it on that basis if it meant that they were going to have to spend another $10, $20 million to build a building, because then they would never build it because it wouldn't pencil out. And those are the kinds of debates, the kinds of discussions that I think we refuse, or are refusing, to have in America today. When you talk about the environment, immediately everybody goes to their corner. And it becomes a partisan issue. And it doesn't have to be. And that's just one example of many, many other issues, and unfortunately are stuck in that pit of partisanship that exists in Washington today. And that's what the book is about. And at this point, I'll entertain questions. Yes?
Since you brought up the question of environment, and there have been so many studies about the potential effects of the rising seas in Miami and our entire surrounding areas in such danger, what kind of long-term planning is going on right now to take care of any kind of fixes to the problem, seawalls or anything else that might be possible, practical, and not cost huge amounts of money?
There are a number of groups. FAU has kind of taken the lead, I think, on that, and had a number of conferences that brought together all kinds of potentially interested parties in that process. The tri-counties are beginning to work on those areas, but there's been very little actually physically done. And here's what's going to happen. I mean, it's expensive today to start taking the steps necessary for what could very well and will likely occur in the future. But it's going to even be more expensive the longer we wait. The problem, and I think fundamentally here's what happens. There hasn't been sort of what Ron, how we grew up with, that elected official, that statesman that actually goes out and really explains this to people in a very common sense, practical point of view. This is not about Democrats or Republicans. It either has risen or it hasn't risen. And I don't know if it's the year 2050 or the year 2082, or I don't know when, okay? But it is rising, and that is measurable. And scientists have measured the rise. And so we need to start taking steps to be able to deal with this in the future, because it's not going to go away. And there's no one explaining that. So if you bring that up today, again, the corners. Some people will say, well, you're one of those tree-hugging liberals, and that's why you're talking about these things. But everything that you're saying is not true, and that's blah 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 blah. And we deny what are facts that disinterested scientists from around the world are pointing out is occurring. But there isn't the courage. Like I said, there isn't the courage. There isn't the vision. There isn't that sense of statesmanship, which is what you should have if you're there in the first place, that is explaining the issue in a way that people will understand and that people will have to pay for it, because we have to pay for it. But like a friend of mine used to say on the city commission, most people want to go to heaven, they just don't want to die.
And you were talking about the consolidation and the